Hi, welcome back. I recently cleared a bunch of my needles, but I have a problem because I can't decide which project to cast on from my fall project plans. So I decided why not swatch for every project and then see which one is calling to me. It is a rainy, gloomy day today. The sun is just barely peeking out from the clouds. The vibes are immaculate, so it is the perfect day to just stay inside and knit. So first I want to open my new yarn. I am working mostly from stash yarn, but I did need to buy some yarn to go with what I currently have. Ooh, okay, I got two different yarns. The first is this BC Garn Bio Shetland. You know what? I ordered the wrong yarn. I meant to order Bio Balance. I'm not sure how that happened. So this is 100% pure organic wool. I meant to order the wool and cotton because this is for my Viola tee, so I was gonna do a t-shirt with this as the main color. Well, this swatch will have to wait because I think I will exchange this for the right yarn. I've never done that before. I really don't know how that happened. Yeah, I wanted the Bio Balance, not the Bio Shetland. This does feel like a nice wool though. Okay, the second thing that I got is this Harrisville Designs Highland. This is the correct one in the colorway Iris. And this is to go with my chartreuse. And I think they look really good together. This one is maybe a little bit darker in person than it appeared on my screen, not by much. But that actually might work out better for this color combo. I think those look really good together. I decided to cast on the Bloom instead of the Clio. So that's what I'm gonna be swatching for. Okay, well what I'm gonna do now is pull out my yarn winder in Swift and wind these hanks up so that I can get started. And I'm not sure if I want to swatch, I'm not sure which one I want to swatch first. Like I told you, I can't decide. But if I really had to choose, it would be between the Bloom Colorwork sweater and my Handspun sweater. I'm knitting the Port by Ozetta, or at least that's what I'm gonna swatch for. I think it's gonna work out. But yeah, I just need to decide between these two. To probably nobody's surprise, I have decided to swatch my handspun yarn first, but I did go ahead and wind up the rest of the hanks. So I'll be swatching for the Port Cardigan by Ozetta. This is not the Port jacket, it is the cardigan. So it is a DK weight, crew neck, stockinette cardigan. It's pretty basic. I haven't decided what size I'll cast on yet. Probably like the medium, or usually I'm like the third size, but I'm gonna cast on my swatch with the recommended needle size, which is a 4.5 millimeter or US 7, and see what gauge I get with this needle. I'm just putting the cable on my interchangeable needles. All right, and this pattern has 21 stitches and 28 rows per 4 inches or 10 centimeters in stockinette stitch, and it's worked flat because it's a cardigan. I honestly don't really mind swatching. Like, if I didn't have to do it and I could get perfect gauge, I would prefer that, but I feel like it gives me a good opportunity with the yarn and the needles to see if I enjoy it, to see if I like the fabric that I'm knitting up. To me, it's like an extension of the planning phase. Like, I've spent all of this time planning my project, and now I get to see if what I've planned is actually going to work out. And that's why I like to knit large swatches most of the time. There are some exceptions, but I just really like to get as accurate of a gauge as I can from the start. That is definitely how I am able to knit so many successfully fitting sweaters. I also knit off gauge quite a bit and change the gauge of patterns, and to do that, I have to know for sure what my gauge is. So I always take my time with it. I don't really see it as like a blocker to knitting. I just see it as part of the process. And it's just another thing that takes some time. Like, I wish it didn't take as long as it did, but that's just the way it is. Okay, I'm loving this like peach and green that I'm getting right at the start of this skein, and it's about to go into the rest of the peach. The only thing to me that is annoying about swatching is that I have to let it dry fully before I can get started. Like, I wish that I could just have an instantly blocked swatch and then cast on. But since I'm doing a swatch party, I get to start knitting again right after I finish this. But I feel like that's why a swatch party is a good idea. Like, we should start this. This should be a thing. Swatch your next few projects all at once, block your swatches, and then you'll be ready to go whenever you want to cast on your next project. I feel like it's a good idea. Okay, obviously it's not finished or blocked yet, but my gauge is looking a little bit loose, a little big. So I'm gonna just do a quick measurement just to get an idea of what the stitches are doing. I'm getting like 4 stitches per inch, and this pattern calls for 5 1/4 stitches per inch. So before I commit to making this entire thing, I'm going to go down a needle size. I might even want to go down 2 needle sizes, but because this is hand spun, it's a little inconsistent. So I don't want to commit yet to going down 2 needle sizes because I do suspect that my gauge is off due to my hand spun. So I'm gonna go down to a 4mm needle and we'll just see. I'm just gonna get a vibe from it and see once I knit a little bit bigger of a swatch if this is closer to the gauge. I did end up needing to go down 1 more needle size. So last night I finished my swatch on a US 5 or 3.75mm, and this looks much closer to gauge. I definitely wasn't sure about the needle size. Getting a gauge of 21 stitches on DK weight yarn with a US 7 seemed like that was going to be really hard for me based on past experience. Like, I would think that I would need to at least use a 5, if not even a 4. This looks much closer to what I would expect, and I really like the color progression here. I just barely started in at the like brown gold, and this is unblocked, so I'm going to measure my gauge before blocking and after blocking, but I'm gonna wait until I have a little stockpile of swatches before I block, and then I'll just block them all at once. And last night I also knit the swatch for the bloom sweater, and here is how it turned out. I just knit the flower from the chart as my swatch on a US 9 or 5.5mm. I think the contrast is nice. This Harrisville Designs, I checked online again, and it definitely appears as a lighter, more purpley color on their website, again, at least on my screens. But in person, it's definitely more of a darker, bluer tone, but I think it works really well with the green, so not mad about that. I haven't measured this yet, but I do feel like the tension is pretty decent. And so again, I'm going to measure before blocking and after blocking. Yeah, this one is just gonna be really good. So I'm very excited for both of these. And I'm gonna just continue my swatch party today. So I have 2 more sweaters to swatch for. I am gonna hold off on swatching for the Viola tee, which I did order the Bio Balance. I ordered it last night. Unfortunately, I couldn't order it from Wool & Co because they are largely sold out of their Bio Balance. I mean, I could wait and see if they get it back in stock, but with all of the tariffs and duties and US shipping issues, I don't know if that'll be anytime soon. So I ended up finding it from Spun, which is a yarn shop in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I've ordered from them once before, and both times they have been very quick to ship. Last time I ordered, they shipped the same day that I placed the order. And this time I ordered really late last night and they shipped it early this morning. For now, I have 2 more sweaters to swatch for. So the first is the Larch Pullover, and I'm going to be swatching out of this Rowan felted tweed that I got from a D-stash. And the other one is for the Agnete cardigan by Petite Knit out of Sandnes Garn Double Sunday. It is going to be very important that I swatch for this and really make sure that this is the yarn I want to use for this pattern. And here's why. So I was watching Sophie from the Knit Pearl Girl talk about Sandnes Garn's Peer Gynt and how that was her like holy grail yarn. I really want to try it. But in that video, she talked about how Sandnes Garn's Double Sunday, or maybe it was just Sunday, I can't remember, but she was talking about this yarn line. This is 100% merino wool, it's non-superwash, but she mentioned that it has a huge tendency to stretch and that she would not knit anything with it if she wasn't also holding a strand of mohair to give it stability. The irony is that the Agnete cardigan does call for mohair, but I decided to order a DK weight yarn instead. As soon as I heard her say that, I was like, well shit, because I'm planning on knitting a full brioche cardigan, and brioche already tends to stretch a lot. The thing is, brioche tends to stretch widthwise and not lengthwise, but obviously I don't want this cardigan to start stretching out. It's definitely a lesson in testing yarn out before buying a full sweater quantity, but if this doesn't work out for this cardigan, I will just knit something else out of it, a stitch pattern that doesn't stretch as much. But anyway, I'm still gonna test it out because I do want this cardigan in this yarn. So we're gonna see how this does. I'm gonna make a pretty large swatch and give it a good test. So these are the 2 that I will be swatching today, and then I will block all of my swatches and we'll get to see what they look like after blocking. I have updates for you. First, here is my swatch for the Larch Pullover. It's just stockinette in the round, unblocked. My experience with this swatch ended up being quite similar with my Port cardigan swatch because this pattern is asking you to get 24 stitches per 4 inches, which is 6 stitches per inch, on a US 6 or 4mm needle with sport weight yarn. I'm sure some people can hit that gauge with that needle size, but I cannot. So I ended up going down to a 3.25mm or a US 3 to, I think, hit gauge. Obviously I haven't blocked it yet, so we'll find out, but this looks much closer to gauge than what I was getting. So we'll see once I block it if the 3.25 is going to work. That will mean I need to go down to a 2.25 for some of the ribbing. By the way, I think that the relationship between needle size and gauge is sometimes talked about in a confusing way. I have heard people say that they aren't able to get gauge on the needle that the pattern calls for, but they don't want to go down needle sizes because they can't imagine knitting a sweater on a small needle. But the thing is, if you want to knit that pattern, you are going to be knitting at that gauge no matter what needle size you use. So if I got gauge on a 4mm needle, that's the same thing as if I got gauge on a 3.25mm needle. I'm just having to go down needle sizes for my personal knitting gauge. Basically, I'm just trying to separate needle size from gauge because even though there is somewhat of a standard out there as far as like what needle size should get you what gauge on what weight of yarn, which is why I have been a bit confused about these 2 patterns because they have called for a tight gauge on larger needles, that still doesn't necessarily mean anything because that's the gauge that the designer was able to get on that needle size. So even though a pattern will suggest a needle size, it really doesn't matter. Like, the thing that matters is the gauge. If you don't want to knit a sweater on small needles, I think what's really happening is you don't want to knit a sweater at such a small gauge, and you can look at sweaters that have larger gauges and you're less likely to have to go down to a smaller needle size. If you're still with me, I'm going to continue talking about gauge because I swatched for the Agnete cardigan with the Sandnes Garn Double Sundae, and here's where I got. I did not knit a full swatch because by this point I could tell that this pattern is not going to work out with this yarn. But not for the reason that I suspected before I knit my swatch, because this is knit at a very tight gauge, and I don't think that this would stretch too much just because it's so dense. The Agnete cardigan calls for 19 stitches per 4 inches, so that's 4.75 stitches per inch in brioche. I knit my swatch on a 2.75 millimeter, which is US 2. The pattern calls for a US 2.5, so that'd be a 3 millimeter, which as far as I'm aware is not as available in the US. I don't have it in my interchangeable set, and I don't have that needle size. So I just knit this on a 2. But I did get gauge, at least before blocking. But going back to the gauge conversation, this is far too dense for me to knit a full sweater in. I got this far before I had to call it. So I know I would not enjoy knitting this pattern in this yarn. And I think this mostly comes down to my yarn substitution. So yes, you do generally have to knit brioche at a fairly tight gauge because, as I mentioned earlier, it has a tendency to stretch, and it's just nicer if it's knit at a smaller gauge. But I think this yarn is too... I did not explain this very well, so here I am on the voiceover trying to explain it better. What I was going to say is that I think this yarn is a little too close to a true worsted than a DK, which is why it felt so bad to knit with at this gauge, because it's quite a thick yarn on such a small needle size. But what I'll talk about in a minute is that I like this yarn because it has 5 plies, which gives it really good stitch definition. Even though this yarn is not going to work out for this pattern, I do have a different idea, and let's get into that. So I find it interesting that I ended up not liking this yarn for this pattern for a different reason than what I thought was going to happen. I mean, I don't know. I haven't gotten this wet yet, so maybe it does want to stretch all out, but I just feel like this in particular is so dense of a gauge that it wouldn't stretch too much, but I just can't. I can't knit at this tight of a gauge with this dense of a yarn. That being said, I am a fan of this yarn so far. I did knit a second swatch because I'm pivoting. I am changing directions from the Agnete cardigan. I still would like to knit it someday, but it's just too tight of a gauge for this yarn. And I think if I do end up knitting it, I will stick to the yarn suggestion of knitting a fingering weight held with a lace weight, because I think that is the way to get that gauge while still being able to knit somewhat comfortably. But after I decided that the Agnete cardigan was a no-go for this yarn, I looked at a lot of different patterns, mostly textured sweaters, because I really liked the stitch definition that I was getting out of this yarn. I think it is really beautiful. So this let me know that I wanted to knit something very textured with this yarn. And after looking at a lot of inspiration, I didn't end up landing on a pattern that I am especially drawn to. I have a few ideas, but there was nothing that I really wanted to make. But I couldn't get this specific motif out of my head that I had seen on a couple different sweaters, which is this chevron texture, just out of Knits and Pearls. I think it's called like a seed stitch chevron, but even though I own like 5 stitch dictionaries, I actually didn't end up finding this exact stitch pattern in any of them. I searched online, I still didn't find this exact stitch pattern, but that's where I saw the like seed stitch chevron name come up. But I ended up just charting this myself. It is pretty simple, but it is a repeating pattern. And I just can't get this out of my head. Like, Chevrons were really popular in like the 2010s era, and I loved them back then. And I have no idea if they're coming back, but I just really like the way this looks in a knit fabric. And I'm picturing probably a cardigan with this texture on the front and then a different texture on the back in the sleeves. So now I'm like, should I design this sweater that I have in my head? And that's what I'll knit out of this yarn, which would be a lot of work and it would take a long time, but I just can't get it out of my head. I'm getting like 5-ish stitches per inch, which might totally change with blocking, but this density just seems much closer to what I would expect to get from a DK weight yarn, and this was much more comfortable for me to knit. So I don't know, I'm just dreaming up some ideas at this stage, but I'm pretty set on not going with brioche with this yarn, and I'm curious to see what's going to happen once I get this wet. So now that I've knit all of my swatches, at least all the ones that I can, still waiting on the Viola tea swatch. Now that I have these 4 swatches, it is time to block them. Before I do that, I will take better measurements of my pre-blocked gauge and make sure to document all of that. And then I'll see you again once these are fully dry. My swatches are in fact dry now. They have been fully blocked, and I knit a few more swatches because my BioBalance arrived in the mail. So I knit a plain stockinette swatch, and I knit the Colorwork swatch for the Viola tea. I think it turned out great. I'm so excited to work with these colors. And this is the start of the chart, so it will be like that. That will be the yoke. I think that's gonna look really nice. And the BioBalance was definitely worth the wait. It worked so much better for this project than the Shetland would have. There was a period where I was considering just keeping the Shetland and accepting my fate and knitting the project in that and just doing full sleeves. But I'm really glad that I stuck with my original idea and decided to order this. To my knowledge, this is the first time I've knit with a wool and cotton blend. To my knowledge, like I can't think of any yarn that I've knit with. So I think this is my first time trying it, and it is a really nice yarn. It is very soft. It has some bounciness from the wool, but it also has like a slickness from the cotton. And this is definitely going to be a yarn that I use again. Here's my stockinette swatch, and I feel like you can just kind of tell based on the way that it looks. Like, it's very drapey, it's very soft, but the stitch definition is definitely there. And I really want to try like all the wool and cotton blends out there that exist. So I'm really excited to knit this project and work with this yarn. This is the yarn that the Viola tea pattern calls for, by the way. Obviously I'm not knitting, like the contrasting colors are not this yarn. But yeah, I don't often knit with the same yarn that the pattern calls for, but I'm really glad that I decided to do that in this case. And then the other swatch that I knit since we last spoke is just my single color swatch for the Bloom sweater. I typically do knit at least 2 swatches for my Colorwork sweaters. I knit the Colorwork swatch and then I knit just the main color, I guess, unless the entire sweater would be in Colorwork. But I especially wanted to knit a single color swatch for this sweater because I already know that this gauge is a little off. It's actually quite a bit off, and so I wanted to see what I would get with just holding one yarn. And so far this is much closer to the pattern gauge, so I might have to do some math here to figure that out. But let's go ahead and measure my gauge for all of my swatches. There's a lot. So here's how I like to do this. I believe this method came from Suzanne Bryan. That is where I learned it from, at least. But the idea is that you take 3 measurements each of your stitch and your row gauge, and you average them out to get your true stitch and row gauge. So I'll be taking a total of 6 measurements per swatch so that if there's any variation in my knitting tension, that is accounted for in the gauge that I'm getting. So this is like a little bit of an extra method. Like, I don't think everybody needs to do this with every swatch. This is just what I like to do. I have found that when I am extra about my gauge, I know what to expect from my knitting and I'm able to produce the results that I want. So that's why I do it this way. And there are a couple tips to being able to get a good measurement. So what you'll need is a ruler. I like to use a hard ruler because I just find it measures much more accurately. And some sort of pins. These are blocking pins. You can use sewing pins. You could use tapestry needles, whatever. But I'll show you why these are helpful. And let's actually start out with just a single color swatch. Okay, so first I'm going to take a couple of pins and mark out a stitch area at the top of my swatch and only include stitches that I don't think are being manipulated by the edge. So I knit the swatch in the round, but it's laying flat because I measured out how much yarn I was going to need for each round, which is what all of this is doing here. That's just hanging out there. And I have pretty clean edges, but I would say, especially on this edge, I'm not going to measure the first 2 stitches here. And then on this edge, since it's not laying perfectly flat, I'll do the same too. I'll exclude the 2 outer stitches on the edge here. And so moving inward from that, at the top of my swatch, I'm just gonna mark out the edge of the 3rd stitch in on both sides. Okay, so here is what I'm deeming my actual gauge with those side stitches excluded. The reason that we put these pins here is that it makes it really easy to take your hard ruler and measure your stitches, because all you're gonna do is line up the edge of your ruler, or like where the measurement starts, with the pin, and then the measurement you're going to take is the one that's lined up with your other pin. So sometimes with knit fabric, because it's so flexible and imperfect or imprecise, it can be hard to figure out what is half a stitch or a quarter of a stitch. It's just a difficult fabric to measure accurately. And so this removes the ambiguity of measuring partial stitches because we're only measuring whole stitches here. And we can always do math to figure out a stitch gauge over like 4 inches, for example. So it doesn't matter what this measurement is. We don't have to measure that specific measurement on our swatch. And I have found this is just a much easier way to measure your swatch. So I'm gonna take 3 of these measurements. So I'm at the top of the swatch here. I'll take another one in the middle and I'll take another one at the bottom. And for my first measurement, I will just write this down. So this is, let's see, 4 and that's a quarter. So that would be 4 5/16, which is a wild number to refer to as your stitch gauge, but this is going to be an average. So I'm just gonna write that down. Before I take my pins out, I'm just gonna count how many stitches I have in between. 18 stitches, and I will continue to measure 18 stitches all the way down, but I'll move my pins into about the middle of the swatch. And as long as your pins are lined up with the edge of the actual stitches that you want to measure, then you're good to go. So I'll line up my ruler, and for this measurement, I'm getting 4 1/4 exactly. And then last measurement, I don't want to get too close to my live edge here, but we can get fairly close since our edge is not really restricting the stitches. It just might be pulling them ever so slightly. So I just don't want to rely on like the stitches all the way down here to be perfectly accurate. So for this measurement, I'm actually getting close to 4 1/2. That is 4 7/16. All right, next, now that I've recorded all of my stitch gauge measurements, I'm going to take my row gauge. So for this, we're going to measure here, here, and here. So coming in a couple of rows here, I will just mark my rows. And this pin is going to mark the top of the stitches beneath it. So we're not measuring the stitches that the pin is sticking into. And then I'm just going to mark the same 2 knit columns, but down here. This pin will mark the bottom of the 2 stitches above it. And then I'll count how many stitches are between the pins. I am getting 24 rounds, so I'll write that down and then measure, lining up the ruler with our pins. And I am getting 3 15/16. I'm right before the 4-inch mark. And obviously you can do this in centimeters. That would be more accurate. That measurement is exactly 4 inches. And we'll do one more. Let me make sure I have the right amount of rows here. And here I'm getting 3 3/4. So that's quite a lot of variation, more than I would have expected, honestly. But this is a bit of an open knit, like it's got quite a lot of room in between the stitches. So that is why it is important to take the average, even on such a small swatch like this. And by the way, when I block my swatches, I don't pin them out. I just pat them out flat and let them dry that way. And they do tend to dry flat, even in just stockinette. So you can see here that my edge curls in ever so slightly, but the rest of the swatch is quite flat. So I can just exclude those edge stitches from my measurement. But I just have never found it necessary to pin my swatches. I just pat them out and they tend to dry that way. I don't like aggressively stretch them or anything. I just very gently kind of make sure that they're flat. I am going to average these numbers to get both of my stitch and my row gauge. And to do that, I find it easiest to convert these to decimals instead of fractions. Honestly, just look up a fraction to decimal calculator. I'm just gonna round to the nearest hundredths. So 5/16 becomes 0.31. Of course, 1/4 becomes 0.25. So I'm gonna average my stitch gauge first. To average my numbers, I just need to add them all up. So 4.31 plus 4.25 plus 4.44, that gives me 13. And then I just need to divide this number by how many numbers I added up, which was 3. That gives me 4.33 repeating. I'm just gonna write it as 4.33. So that means that I have 18 stitches over 4.33 inches. And when you see a gauge with partial stitches and you're wondering how they measured to know exactly that they were getting, 1/4 of a stitch, this is most likely what they're doing, at least conceptually, maybe not this exact method. But what you can do with this measurement now is you can say, I want to represent my gauge over 4 inches, not 4.33 inches. So to do that, I can divide 18 by 4.33 to get my stitches per inch. That's gonna give us a big number, but just multiply that by 4 if you wanna get 4 inches, or 10 if you're working in centimeters. And that will give you how many stitches you're getting per 4 inches. So in my case, I'm getting 16.62, and I would probably round that down to just say I'm getting 16.5 stitches over 4 inches. And I'll just do the exact same thing for my round gauge or my row gauge. I personally like to think about gauge as how many stitches or rounds I'm getting per 1 inch. That's just the way my brain works. So I always convert patterns to see what their stitch gauge is over 1 inch instead of 4 inches. But obviously the convention is to measure over 4 inches or 10 centimeters. So let me convert the bloom pattern gauge. Okay, so my gauge is a little bit tighter which actually might work out because I know my colorwork gauge is a little bit tighter. So I'm going to represent all of these numbers over 1 inch. So my stitch gauge is 4.125 and the pattern calls for 4. So I'm just a little bit tighter on the stitch gauge. My round gauge is 6.125 and the pattern calls for 5.5. So again, just a little bit shorter in the round gauge. With something as simple as a round yoke construction, I will probably consider this close enough, and I will do some math to figure out what size I want to cast on. But the thing about my gauge that I'm getting is I don't really want to knit this at a looser gauge. So I could go up a needle size and probably hit the pattern's gauge. But I don't think I want my gauge to be any looser than this. Like, I'm pretty comfortable with the gauge that this is at. And so I'm gonna measure my colorwork gauge. We'll see how far off I am on that. And if I'm about the same percent off for both of my swatches, then that's gonna be really easy. If I'm quite off, that is going to be a little bit trickier. But I think what I'll do is just prioritize making sure the yoke fits me, and then the rest of the body and the sleeves are pretty adaptable, and that will be pretty easy to change up if I need to. So now I'm going to measure the rest of my swatches and get an average of my stitch and row gauge, compare that to the pattern, see where I'm at, and from there I can make all of my decisions about what size I want to cast on and what modifications, if any, I want to make. It's a process, but trust the process. It does work out. So I will do the rest of my measuring and then I'll meet you back up and let you know where I'm at with all of these. Okay, that took a little bit of time, got it done, and none of my swatches hit gauge, which is okay. And actually, I kind of want to normalize that if I can, because I so frequently don't get the exact gauge for a pattern unless it is a pattern that really needs me to get gauge, and then I will try to get gauge. But most of the time, I knit on a needle size that I think works well with the yarn and at a gauge that I am comfortable knitting and that I like the fabric that I'm getting. This is not to say that gauge is not important. It is very important. But if you want to knit off gauge, it's not that hard to do. And I encourage you to try it if you haven't had a chance to. So yeah, none of my swatches hit the gauge of the patterns that I'm hoping to knit, but that's okay. Actually, Bloom was the closest. So I am just going to let you know the discrepancy between my gauge and the pattern gauge, just so I'm not rattling off a ton of numbers. Well, I'll show all the numbers on the screen, but I won't read all of them out. So for Bloom, for my stockinette swatch, I got a stitch discrepancy of 0.125, basically 0.1 stitches off, and a round discrepancy of 0.625. So my round gauge is a little bit more off, but my stitch gauge is like basically there. My colorwork gauge is quite a bit more off. My stitch and round gauge are both 0.5 off. So I think I will end up going up a needle size for my colorwork and probably stick to the same needle size for the rest of the sweater. For the Viola tee, my stockinette gauge is 0.25 stitches off. My gauge is a little bit looser, and my round gauge is 1.1 rounds off. My round gauge is actually a little bit tighter. So that's kind of interesting. Normally I would probably attribute that to the fiber content, the wool and cotton blend, but the pattern calls for this blend, so I don't know. My colorwork discrepancy is a little bit more off. Mine is 0.4 stitches looser, which is interesting. I don't usually knit Colorwork at a looser gauge than a pattern. And my round gauge is basically spot on. It is 0.1 off. So I might run into some issues if I decide to go down a needle size to account for my stitch gauge. But with a Colorwork round yoke, that is just going to mean that my Colorwork is going to end a little bit higher on this design. That is fine with me. So I will probably end up going down a needle size for this sweater. Oh, and I forgot to mention that I swatched with the needle size that the pattern called for both the Viola tee and Bloom. For my Larch pullover, as you know, I ended up going down, I think 3 needle sizes, and my gauge is still too loose. I am half a stitch off, and my round gauge is much closer. I'm just 0.1 rounds off, so to me that's close enough to just call that good. But half a stitch off, not good, unless of course I want to do some math, which I probably will end up doing because I don't think that I want to knit this gauge any tighter. It's not incredibly tight at all. Like, you can see the light through it, at least, you know, with a light source directly behind it. It's not like you can see through the fabric on its own if I were to wear it, but I just don't think I want a sweater that's any denser than this. And interestingly enough, the pattern does not call for a fisherman's rib gauge. It just calls for a stockinette gauge. So I might end up playing around with this pattern a little bit anyway. The more I think about it, I might end up trying to hit gauge for this one, just because 5.5 stitches per inch on a sport weight yarn is a little bit loose for my taste now that I really sit with it. Like, maybe this is too loose, especially when you look at it like that. So I'm gonna play around with this, and I might end up going down a couple more needle sizes and trying to hit that 6 stitch gauge. I think I can. It's not gonna be that difficult, so I may as well try and see if I like that fabric. The other swatch that I am going to reknit is for the Port cardigan, because I was also half a stitch too loose on this one, despite going down several needle sizes. For this, I think my handspun will be really nice at a slightly tighter gauge. And so I think what I'm gonna do is go down 1 needle size, see what gauge I get, and then knit the cardigan no matter what, because this is like ever so slightly too loose for what I was wanting. So I might not actually hit the pattern gauge with this, but I would like to knit it a little bit tighter than what I'm getting here. My round gauge, again, was basically spot on. I was just 0.1 rounds off per inch, so I'm gonna go down a needle size. That'll probably take care of the discrepancy in my rounds, and we'll see what stitch gauge I get. And for my last swatch, which I'm not trying to hit a specific gauge for, oh, the sun just went behind the clouds, I am getting 5.07 stitches per inch and 5.07 rounds per inch. So this stitch pattern is producing a perfectly square gauge, and I like this gauge quite a bit. It has a decent amount of drape. It's not really see-through. Of course, a little bit of light is gonna come through, which you can see, but I wouldn't describe the fabric as see-through in any way, because again, once you're wearing it, like, you're not gonna be able to see through it. It feels really nice. It was comfortable to knit at this gauge, so that's the gauge that I will use if I decide to put this stitch pattern in some sort of sweater. Well, thanks for coming to my swatch party. This was fun. I feel like I made a lot of important decisions about how I'm going to cast on, and I feel really excited to cast all of these new projects on. So I hope you'll join me for that, and I hope your fall knitting plans, or just your knitting plans, are going well. See you later.